Ich begrüße Sie, euch alle sehr herzlich. I was asked to do the introduction in German, but Sophia Rohwetter, she did a perfect translation of this text. Who needs to have an English translation? Please raise your hands in order to follow the introduction. The later panels will be all in English. Okay, ich begrüße alle Konferenzgäste und Besucherinnen sehr herzlich zu den nun bevorstehenden Nachmittagspanels. An dieser Stelle umfassender Dank an den Stiftungsrat, an Paul Dujardin, Brigitte Franzen, auf die nun Carla Cugini gefolgt ist, an Otto Hochreiter, Gerald Matt, Theresia Niedermüller, Gabriele Schor, Pia Theis, Gottfried Thomann und Thomas Trummer für Ihre inhaltlichen Anstöße und Vorschläge zur Konferenz und zu den heutigen Panels. Danke vor allem auch an Bettina Brunner für die perfekte Organisation. Das war weit mehr als Organisation, das war auch inhaltliche Mitgestaltung. Und an Sophia Rohwetter für logistische Unterstützung. Danke an Carola Kraus, Rainer Fuchs und das gesamte Mumok-Team, das uns hier auf allen Ebenen unterstützt hat. Auf die beiden gestrigen, in jeder Weise instruktiven Vorträge von Brigitte Franzen und Max Hollein folgen heute 2 Diskussionsrunden, die mit Diversity in modernen und zeitgenössischen Museen und künstlerische Intervention in Sammlungen überschrieben sind. Wir knüpfen mit der Thematik der beiden heutigen Panels an Fragestellungen und Verfahren an, die in der Tradition der Institution und Kulturkritik stehen und die seit den 1980er Jahren mit Inhalten und Methoden der Cultural Studies, dabei vor allem Black, Gender und Postcolonial Studies verbunden sind. Dabei haben wir jene Kritikpositionen im Blick, die sich allererst auf Sammlungsagenten beziehen. Zu denken wäre, kannst du kurz irgendwie kriegst nicht bewegt? Zu denken wäre hier an ein, emblematisches Beispiel, Fred Wilson, Mining the Museum von 1992/93, die als eine temporäre Neuaufstellung der permanenten Sammlung der Maryland Historical Society Race als zentrales Ein- und Ausschlusskriterium adressierte und dabei die Abwesenheit von People of Color aus dem herrschenden Kanon thematisierte und auf ihren Status als unsichtbare Servicekräfte hinwies. Dem korrespondiert eine Reihe weiterer künstlerischer Infragestellungen des herrschenden Kanons, die ein reiches Spektrum an parallelen, alternativen und miteinander verflochtenen Genealogien der modernen und zeitgenössischen Kunst eröffnet haben. Die aus künstlerischen Interventionen in die dominante Kunstgeschichtsschreibung abgeleiteten Strategien basieren auf Konzepten wie Denaturalisierung, Gendering, Queering, Dekolonisierung und Contact Zone. Begriffe, welche museale Kunstsammlungen der Kanonkritik unterziehen und inklusive Autorschafts-, Werk- und Qualitätsbegriffe reklamieren. Soweit sich private und öffentliche Sammlungen überhaupt noch klar voneinander trennen lassen, werden sie zum Schauplatz der Auseinandersetzung der Komplizenschaft von Sammlungspolitik und Kunstgeschichtsschreibung, aber auch der Komplizenschaft von politischen und ökonomischen Interessen. In Österreich, Deutschland, zuletzt der Schweiz gab und gibt es eine Reihe kontrovers geführter Debatten, wie die aktuelle Ausstellung von Anna Hoffner, ex-Prolowitsch, ich hoffe, ich habe es richtig ausgesprochen, in der Kunsthalle hier nebenan dokumentiert, fokussieren sich gerade der Institutionskritik zugeordnete Künstlerinnen auf die Rolle von ideologisch motivierten Schenkungen an Museen, die Kompensation mangelnder Ausstellungsproduktion durch die Repräsentation privater Sammlungen sowie deren Rolle für Lifestyle und Wertproduktion. So münzte die Künstlerin Louise Lawler ihre Arbeiten auf sozusagen die Form, in der mit Sammlungen Lifestyle-Produktion und Wertproduktion betrieben wird. Und so münzte die Künstlerin Andrea Fraser in ihrem 1985 publizierten Text In and Out of Place, da war die österreichische Ludwig-Stiftung gerade 4 Jahre alt, auf das fotografische Werk von Louise Lawler. Hier sehen Sie eines der berühmten Beispiele, deren fotografisches Werk in das repräsentative Image von Sammlungen interveniert und das vor allem für den US-amerikanischen Kontext charakteristische Abhängigkeitsverhältnis des Museums von privaten Sammlungen in ihrer Funktion als ökonomisch machtvolle und mit Legitimationshoheit ausgestattete Institution. Dabei zeigen die anspruchsvolleren Arbeiten, dass sie nicht außerhalb dieser Mechanismen stehen, sondern dass sie dieses verinnerlicht haben, dass zugleich die Form der Reproduktion Möglichkeiten des Widerspruchs und der Veränderung bergen. Künstlerinnen, die ihr Augenmerk auf nicht-westliche Kontexte beziehungsweise auf westliche Systeme und der kulturellen Hegemoniebildung richten, betten sozusagen ihre institutionelle ihre Institutionsanalyse in sozusagen eine Analyse der institutionellen, musealen, aber eben auch privaten Sammlungen ein. Ich denke hier aktuell an den im Rahmen von Enjoy gezeigten Film Unearthing in Conversation von 2017 der Künstlerin Belinda Kasem-Kaminski. Hier ein Ausschnitt. An die von Farid Amalis rekonstruierte Installation The Reorient von 1989 sehen Sie in eine Etage höher rekonstruiert, also zum ersten Mal seit 1989, oder an die von Rux Media gestaltete Ausstellung Hungry for Time, Einladung zu epistemischem Ungehorsam in der Gemäldesammlung der Akademie der Bildenden Künste. Hier sehen Sie noch einen Ausschnitt aus Farid Amalis Installation. Wenn ich hier wiederholt auf institutionskritische Interventionen in Sammlungen referiere, dann kann ein wohlbekannter Künstler nicht unerwähnt bleiben. Es handelt sich um Hans Haacke, der sich wie kein zweiter auf die Figur und Rolle des Sammlers kapriziert hat. Dies sowohl in seinem berühmten Manet-Projekt von 1974, das eine kunsthistorische Provenienzforschung zur Sammlungsgeschichte von Edouard Manets berühmten Spargelstillleben von 1880 darstellt und dabei die maßgebliche Rolle thematisiert, die Hermann Josef Abs in seiner Funktion als Wirtschaftsberater sowohl im NS-Regime als auch unter Konrad Adenauer, dem ersten deutschen Bundeskanzler, eingenommen hat. Das Spargelstillleben wurde dem Wallraf-Richartz-Museum von dessen Förderkreis unter dem Vorstandsvorsitzenden Abs geschenkt. Um dessen Reputation als Philanthrop nicht anzukratzen, lehnte der damalige Direktor des Museums Haakes Manet-Projekt ohne weitere Begründung ab. Glücklicherweise zeigte die Kölner Galerie Paul Menz die Installation. Dasselbe gilt für Haakes Der Pralinenmeister, das 1981 für die in den Kölner Rheinhallen kuratierte Ausstellung Westkunst, zeitgenössische Kunst seit 1939, kuratiert von Laszlo Gloser und Kaspar König, entstand, dort aber bezeichnenderweise nicht präsentiert wurde und erst im Rahmen der Jubiläumsausstellung Wir nennen es Ludwig den Weg ins Kölner Museum Ludwig fand. Das aus 14 bedruckten Tafeln bestehende Werk handelt von der Verflechtung der Ludwig-Sammlung und der Monheim AG, dem Unternehmen von Peter und Irene Ludwig. Hake weigerte sich, dem Pralinenmeister an die Ludwigs zu verkaufen, da er um den Verlust der öffentlichen Präsenz seines Werks fürchtete. Dem Zuschlag erhielt damals das Fluxus-Sammler-Ehepaar Gilbert und Lila Silverman, bevor es 2018 unter dem Direktor Yilmaz Dvejor mit Hilfe der Kulturstiftung der Länder, der Peter und Irene Ludwig Stiftung, unter anderem für das Museum Ludwig angekauft wurde. Speziell das Engagement von Paul Menz mag als Zeichen dafür dienen, dass der sogenannte Kunstbereich kein geschlossenes System ist, entgegen aller Unkenrufe, sondern dass die Beziehungen zwischen Künstlerinnen, Galeristinnen, Sammlerinnen, Kuratorinnen, Kritikerinnen, Kunsthistorikerinnen, natürlich immer mit Binnen-I, immer auch von Interessenskonflikten handeln. Wenn ich an dieser Stelle Kunst- und Museumshistorisch mit Kultur- und institutionspolitischen Agenten verbinde, dann tue ich das auf Wunsch des Stiftungsrats, auch mit selbstkritischem Blick. Eines seiner Mitglieder, die Gründungsdirektorin der Sammlung Verbund, Gabriele Schor, deren Ausstellung Feministische Avantgarde noch bis Anfang nächsten Jahres im Linzer Lentos-Museum zu sehen ist, hat dankenswerterweise eine Geschlechteranalyse der Ankäufe der Ludwig-Stiftung erhoben. Demzufolge wurden für die Jahre von 1981 bis 2017 573 Werke erworben, darunter 45 Werke von Künstlerinnen. Das bedeutet ein Geschlechterverhältnis von 92,2% zu 7,8%. Letzteres mit deutlicher Zunahme in der zweiten Hälfte der 2010er Jahre und seit 2018 mit sprunghaft ansteigender Geschwindigkeit. Von insgesamt 96 Werken der in den letzten 4 Jahren erworbenen Werke stammen 55 von Künstlerinnen und 41 von Künstlern. Das entspricht einem Verhältnis von 57,3% Frauen und 42,7% Männer. Diese Trendumkehr ist selbstredend nicht nur dem Stiftungsrat, sondern auch den Einreichungen der Bundesmuseen zu verdanken, die sich ihrerseits der Diversifizierung verpflichtet sehen. Es wäre selbstredend ein Phantasma anzunehmen, dass Desiderate und Missverhältnisse in Museumssammlungen ohne weiteres kompensiert werden können. Dass hergebrachte Werk- und Qualitätskriterien wie Kontinuität und Kohärenz einer historisch-kritischen Revision bedürfen, macht, wie gestern gehört, eine vielschichtigere Kontextualisierung und Vermittlung von Ankaufsentscheidungen erforderlich. Die Überprüfung bestehender Urteilskriterien geht dabei nicht zuletzt mit der veränderten Operationsweise institutioneller Akteurinnen und der Neuzusammensetzung ihrer Netzwerke im Rahmen einer erweiterten, zugleich von neoliberaler Austerität bedrohten Institutionalität einher. Nicht zu vergessen in diesem Kontext ist die übergreifende Restitutionsdebatte sowie der hiermit einhergehende und in die DNA von Sammlungen eingreifende Frage des Eigentums. In den 2 Panels verbinden sich strukturelle mit inhaltlichen Fragestellungen, die wir, wie bereits gestern gehört, für die Frage nach den Zukunftsperspektiven von Kunstsammlungen öffnen wollen. Aber was bedeutet es, wenn sich der Gegenkanon nicht mehr in lange Zeit dominanten Innovations-, Emanzipations- und Fortschrittsversprechen gründet? Was heißt das für die hier zur Diskussion stehende Vermittlung von Geschichts-, Gegenwarts- und Zukunftsbegriffen, sowohl für die Inhalte von Museumssammlungen als auch für ihre personellen und logistischen Strukturen? Was heißt das für institutionalisierte Wertvorstellungen und den hieran geknüpften Bildungsauftrag? Fragen, auf die wir in der einen und anderen Weise in den nun folgenden Panels sicherlich einige Antworten erhalten. Ich stelle nun die beiden Moderatorinnen vor, die ihrerseits dann die Panel-Teilnehmerin einführen werden. Die erste Diversity in modernen und zeitgenössischen Museen betitelte Diskussionsrunde wird von der Kunsthistorikerin, Kuratorin, Universitätslektorin und Autorin Luise Ziaja moderiert. Sie ist seit 2013 Kuratorin für zeitgenössische Kunst an der österreichischen Galerie Belvedere und seit 2006 Co-Direktorin des postgradualen Masterlehrgangs für Ausstellungstheorie und Praxis /CCM, Educating, Curating, Managing an der Universität für angewandte Kunst in Wien. Sie ist Autorin und Mitherausgeberin zahlreicher Ausstellungskataloge und Sammelbände zu zeitgenössischer, künstlerischer und kuratorischer Praxis, Kunst- und Ausstellungstheorie, darunter die Publikationsreihe Curating, Ausstellungstheorie und Praxis in der Edition Angewandte de Gruyter, sowie zuletzt erschien das Museum der Zukunft, 43 neue Beiträge zur Diskussion über die Zukunft des Museums. Also sie ist eine perfekte Moderatorin für das erste Panel. Ich stelle aber gleich noch den Moderator des zweiten Panels vor, Matthias Michalka, hier vom Haus, der das Panel Künstlerische Intervention in Sammlungen kuratiert, ist Kunsthistoriker und Kurator am Museum Moderner Kunst Stiftung Ludwig Wien. Er kuratierte Gruppenausstellungen wie To Expose, To Show, To Demonstrate, To Inform, To Offer, künstlerische Praktiken um 1990, das war im Jahr 2015, und Objects Recognized in Flashes, das war 2019, sowie zahlreiche Einzelausstellungen, unter anderem mit Zoe Leonard, Florian Pumhösel, Moira Davy, Martin Beck, Loretta Fahrenholz, Dorit Markreiter, und nächste Woche hätte seine Ausstellung mit Wolfgang Tillmanns eröffnen sollen. Die wird jetzt leider verschoben, aber darauf kann man sich schon freuen. Matthias Michalka zeichnet gemeinsam mit Naoko Kaltschmidt für das Mumok Kino verantwortlich und lehrt an der Akademie der Bildenden Künste in Wien. Ich bitte das erste Panel nach vorne, beziehungsweise Luisa.
Thank you, Sabeth, for the introduction, and many thanks to the Austrian Ludwig Foundation for inviting me to chair today's panel entitled Diversity in Museums of Modern and Contemporary Art, as we heard. We have already heard quite a bit about the capabilities, the complexities and challenges of museums, conflicting notions as repositories of arcane artifacts, as time machines, civic institutions of bourgeois society, hegemonic knowledge formations, systems of dominance and of instituting hierarchies within societies along the lines of race, class, and gender, as places of cosmopolitan exchange, sites of memory, as laboratories, public forums, as spaces for critical intellectuality, epistemic disobedience, wilderness of unlearning, as spaces of reimagining other futures. The claim for diversity and inclusion is not at all new, as we all know. Think of history from below or activisms of feminist and civil rights movements, institutional critique or interventions of artists, as we heard before. For the most part, claims put forward from the outside of museums. It has taken a long time for museums to acknowledge its systemic embeddedness in the violence of Western power knowledge, in the Western power knowledge complex, and the pressing need to rethink its Eurocentric logics of representation. Today, we will look into critical curatorial and collecting strategies, as well as into institutional infrastructures, And I'm very much looking forward to the 3 lectures that we will hear in a bit and the discussion afterwards. Due to the time frame, I would ask you to keep questions regarding the individual lectures for the discussion. So we will proceed with each lecture after another and have the discussions afterwards. So let me please introduce our first speaker. Ana Magalha is a Brazilian art historian, curator, professor, and now director of the Museum of Contemporary Art of the University of Sao Paulo, MAC USP. She is an expert in 20th century art, researching modernities in the visual arts in a transnational approach. She has published widely and has curated, of course, many exhibitions. One of the recent projects was Projects for a Modern Everyday Life in Brazil, 1920 to 1960. And her lecture is entitled Critical Curating and Decolonial Studies in the Visual Arts, Revaluating the Collections of the Museum of Contemporary Art of the University of Sao Paulo. Ana, the floor is yours. I'm looking forward to your lecture.
I'm sorry, I have a presentation here. Thanks. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to read to control my time. I would like to thank the organizers of this Ludwig Stiftung Symposium for being here today, and start by saying that I'm presenting this paper on the day we celebrate the national holiday of Black consciousness in Brazil, created by the Brazilian federal government in 2003 and still not adopted in all the country's states as a holiday. The date marks the many struggles of the African descendant communities in Brazil for equality and their combat against racism in the country. The date corresponds to the day one of Brazil's most important Black figures died in combat. Zumbi dos Palmares, the leader of the biggest ex-slaves community ever built in the country during the first century of our colonial period, which resisted its constant attack for decades until it was completely destroyed by militia forces hired by landowners in 1695. I could have made many choices to talk about identity in the framework of the Museum of Contemporary Art of the University of Sao Paulo. From now on, I'm calling it MAC USP. But I chose to tackle the issue by looking back into our historical collections, our efforts to propose a decolonial approach to the works in them, and the attempts we have been making to tell other stories in which many forms of otherness are taken into consideration. In this sense, I take one of the most celebrated paintings in our collections by Brazilian modernist painter Tarsila do Amaral, and consider this work in the light of 2 specific projects in our curatorial program, through which we search to deal with otherness through our institutional history and collections. The first is Da Clareira, and how it has been helping us to introduce such issues and renew our relationship with the museum's surroundings, while providing us with a renovated gaze into our collections. The second is the curatorship of the new exhibition of our permanent collections. I will start by analyzing Tarsila do Amaral's The Negress, then very quickly give some information about the museum's institutional history, and finally present the 2 projects mentioned above. The Brazilian modernist writer Oswald de Andrade, today well known for his Anthropophagite Manifesto of 1928, wrote a previous manifesto, the Manifesto da Poesia Pau-Brasil, literally Brazilwood Poetry Manifesto, which ends with these words, and I'll read it in Portuguese, and you can follow the translation into English in the screen. Bárbaros, crédulos, pitorescos e meigos, leitores de jornal Pau-Brasil. A floresta e a escola, o Museu Nacional, a cozinha, o minério e a dança, a vegetação, Pau-Brasil. Originally published in a São Paulo newspaper in 1924, in it, Oswald makes both references to modernity, the newspaper readers, and to Brazilian colonial history, hence its title. Pau-Brasil, or Brazil wood, was the very precious wood that the legendary Cannibal Tupinambá Indians extracted from the coast of Brazil to trade with the French in the first decades of the country's colonization by the Portuguese, and that made them to be persecuted by the Portuguese, who considered them savage, ferocious, and unreliable. Pau-Brasil Poetry Manifesto is not only understood as one of Oswald's attempts to formulate a new modern aesthetics for Brazilian literature, but also gives us a glimpse of how he and his peers embraced modernity and foresaw its incorporation into a national project for Brazil. I highlighted the expression "the forest and the school" because in it, Oswald recognizes the importance of the contribution of the indigenous communities of the country to our cultural formation. Such utterance goes hand in hand with one of the most celebrated paintings in our collections, that is the Negres by Tarsila do Amaral. When painting this work, Tarsila was Oswald's intellectual partner and wife. Both Oswald's Pau-Brasil Manifesto and Tarsila's work were presented in Paris in the 1920s, where through the help of the French poet and writer Blaise Cendrars, they got in touch with the Parisian artistic circle of modern artists and intellectuals and could promote the initiatives undertaken by them and their friends in São Paulo to modernize Brazil's culture. Their role as the Brazilian avant-garde has been renewed in the last decades, especially after the 24th Bienal de São Paulo in 1998, when Tarsila had a special room with the Negres and many of her most important works on show, and Oswald's anthropophagy was internationally absorbed as a post-colonial concept avant la lettre. After that, Tarsila's work has not only been associated with the Week of 22, which is considered to this day the milestone of Brazilian modernism, even if it was not shown on the occasion. Most importantly, it has been illustrated and used by primary and secondary school teachers to educate their students about modern art in Brazil. Therefore, when visiting MAC USP, Brazilian audiences expect to see the Negres as a masterpiece of our collections. Finally, since the Negres' appearance in a retrospective exhibition of Tarsila's work in the United States in 2017, and the growing popularity enjoyed by her figure and by Brazilian modernism conveyed by her work in the many global art histories being written abroad, international museums have been knocking on our doors to have the painting on loan for temporary exhibitions, reviewing modernism from a global perspective, while African Brazilian artists and intellectuals engage in its critical reading. In addition to this, after 2018, and now preparing for the celebration of the centennial of the Week of 22, and the second centennial of its independence, Brazil has fallen prey to obscurantism in every possible way. International public opinion watches the fires in the Amazon forest escalate and the systematic genocide of indigenous populations, not to mention the deep political, economic, social crisis of the country, even more aggravated by the COVID-19 pandemic. Such times are finally marked by the fire that destroyed the collections of the oldest museum in the country, the National Museum, itself a university museum, mentioned by Oswald in the quotation above. In such a context, it is expected that a university museum of contemporary art be a place of exchange, encounters, and above all, critical thinking. Therefore, the new curatorial program designed for MAC USP has conceived the institution as a laboratory aiming at fostering artistic production, engaging more than ever students in its activities, and investing in interdisciplinary partnerships with scholars, curators, artists, and educators in various fields, embedded in the museum's scholarly research and its collections with the aim to update them in the light of such contemporary issues. On the verge of its 60th anniversary, and permanently installed in its new venue at Ibirapuera Park, MAC USP's curatorial program also recognizes the museum as part of this bigger landscape. Ibirapuera Park, the indigenous Tupi word for the forest that once was a forest, was inaugurated in 1954 to celebrate the 4th centennial of São Paulo, and today is the most popular green area of the city. Moreover, it was designed by architect Oscar Niemeyer and a team of São Paulo architects, and now is declared a cultural landmark for Brazil, which grew around the historical botanical collection of the São Paulo region, thus the metaphor of the forest for the curatorial program of MAC USP. The forest and the school, this binomial proposed by Oswald, has to be updated and put into critical perspective today. After a century of modern experience in Brazil, it is clear to us that we have an asymmetric, hierarchical, and violent relationship with this territory and its original peoples, as well as with the African descendant communities of the country. Originating from the African diaspora due to slavery trades throughout the colonial period of our history, their contribution to our cultural identity is yet to be fully acknowledged. In this sense, Tarsila Negris in our collection has been given new disturbing meanings by the way a white, privileged woman, Tarsila, whose family benefited greatly from enslaved black workers in their farm, alludes here to the figure of a black ama de leite or wet nurse in both a caricatural and sexualized way, the big lips, the big full lips, and the huge breast, as pointed out by many contemporary African Brazilian women artists. This is the case of the two works by artist Rosana Paulino in our collections, in which the depiction of a black woman's body is questioned by the way the artist depicts it as taken as part of nature, so to speak. The confrontation between Rosana's work and Tarsila's Negris was proposed by African-Brazilian curator Igor Simões during the curatorial panel to discuss our collections in the research webinar on decolonial studies and the visual arts and African diasporas in the Americas held at MAC USP in October. MAC USP was founded in 1963 to receive the collections of the São Paulo Museum of Modern Art, the first of its genre in Brazil. In the process of the separation of the institution from the Bienal de São Paulo, which resulted in the creation of the Fundação Bienal de São Paulo and the transfer of its collections to the University of São Paulo. The University of São Paulo thus received a collection of modern art that was formed mainly in the context of the 1950s and in the framework of the editions of the Bienal de São Paulo. This is the case not only of Tarsila's Negris, but also of many other works in our collections. For instance, the celebrated tripartite Unity by Swiss artist Max Bill, understood by Brazilian art historiography as the basis of the development of the concrete art movements in the country along the 1950s. Once at the university, the museum continued to update its collections, and through the research of its first director, art historian Walter Zanini, gained national and international recognition by pioneering the collecting of conceptual practices, video art, and photography. From this first phase of the museum's activity, the work of Brazilian artist Regina Silveira, now with a retrospective exhibition in partnership with this year's edition of the Bienal de São Paulo, is a key example. Here's a work by Silveira that marks the way the museum set a tone for institutional criticism through its collections. Paradoxo do Santo, or Paradox of the Saint, is an installation that the artist first conceived for the Museo del Barrio in New York from the study of a wooden sculpture by a Latin American self-taught artist depicting the figure of Santiago Matamoros, the patron saint of the Spanish colonial army in the conquest of the Americas. Although always interested in phenomena of anamorphies and projection of shadows, Silveira projects the shadow of the little figurine of Santiago Matamoros as the haunting equestrian statue of the patron of the Brazilian army and first president of the country's republic, Marechal Deodoro da Fonseca, designed by modern sculptor Victor Brecheret, the most celebrated artist of the week of 22. The two projects to be considered here in the new curatorial program of MAC USP highlight these aspects of Zanini's thinking, while updating them, looking into contemporary issues. In this sense, the issue of otherness is key in reevaluating our collections. Otherness was central for the project of the Clareira. The Clareira translates as a glade in English and is an area of grass vegetation or of the undergrowth of vegetation locally located inside a forest or woodland. Its formation is vital for the renewal of the forest and for its diversity, as it functions as a kind of a granary. There, new species can emerge, and the existing ones guarantee their survival and germination. In the case of the Amazon rainforest, for example, these are the areas in which nomadic indigenous groups establish temporary settlements. Installed on the ground floor of MAC USP's building, our Clareira is a place for welcoming visitors while enhancing their connection with the ground of the city. A space with glass walls, the museum's ground floor is linked to the outside, a mix of trees, garden, passers-by coming from the park, and just next to this, an expressway that crosses the city of São Paulo from north to south. As a program, the Clareira includes various forms of artistic expression to which visual artists, musicians, performers, dancers, writers, actors, filmmakers, curators, and scholars are invited to present their work on Thursday evenings, alternating with 2 permanent installations of visual arts. First, I'm showing to you a view taken from the outside of the place of the Clareira, while the performance of transgender artist DC was occurring last August. DC's work tackles her life as a sex worker through interviews that she proposes to her white cisgender clients, in which she discusses prejudice against transgender individuals, oppression of sexuality, among other issues. And here, the record of 4 other events we had at the Clareira between September and October. The performance Absent Body, or At Night I Cry, by artist Cristina Elias. The open rehearsal of the São Paulo State Dance Company with a performance of Best Unique Day by Brazilian choreographer Henrique Rodovalho. The reading of the book Exile, Stories of a Prison Hospital by writer Natalia Timmerman in parallel to the screening of the film Without Penalty by Eugênio Pupo, and percussionist Bruna de Prado performing the composition I-131, a radiophonic piece by composer Valéria Bonafé of the feminist music group Sonoras. Both the Clareira and the research webinar MAC USP Curatorial Practices, Critical Curating and Decolonial Studies in the Visual Arts, African Diasporas in the Americas, organized with the help of artist Rosana Paulino and sponsored by the Connecting Art Histories project of the Getty Foundation, were key for us to define the premises through which we are to conceive the permanent collections exhibition of the museum in 2022. Resulting from a group of curators and the guidance of a consultant committee of outside curators, 3 main axes were defined for the selection of works. The first will consider various ways of performing and displaying identity, while questioning the erasure of otherness. The second axis shall deal with the image of a political and social body. The third will be centered in the museum's collection history and how it reflects on a precise experience of modernity in the mid-20th century. To give an example, one of the references of our revision of the museum's collection history is the set of 13 works that US collector and entrepreneur Nelson Rockefeller donated to Brazil through the care of the Institute of Brazilian Architects in 1946 to foster the foundation of the Museums of Modern Art of São Paulo and of Rio de Janeiro. They are all now in our collections and have always been taken by Brazilian art historians to exemplify US cultural hegemony in the country, bearing a direct connection to the promotion of abstract arts. Yet, the works donated by Rockefeller tell a much more complex and richer story. This is the case of the works by African-American artist Jacob Lawrence and by Robert Guethmey here on screen. Exhibited only in the 1950s after arriving in São Paulo, Jacob Lawrence's The Lesson of 1946 is a vivid example of the artist's engagement and prominence in what is known as the New York Harlem Renaissance, the African-American neighborhood in the city that saw the heyday of Black cultural life in the 1930s and 1940s. Lawrence is one of the most representative artists of those days, and his works are testimonies of the contribution of these Black communities for American modern culture in the mid-century. As for Robert Guethmey, his standard-bearer of the same year was never on show, neither at the Museum of Modern Art nor at MAC USP. This might be because the painting is a reminder of the major tensions of civil rights struggles of Black communities in the United States in the mid-20th century. Guethmey creates an allegory of a politician of the South states of the country, holding in his hand a standard with the symbol of justice wrapped around a hanging rope, used in the episodes of lynching of Black persons in the region. The composition also makes reference to the segregation laws in its symbolisms. These two works threw new light not only in the way we narrate the museum's collection history, but also suggest new dimensions to works such as Tarsilas Negras and Everything That It Hides, or The Shining Surface of Max Bill's Tripartite Unity. The latter, understood as an expression of modernity's rationality and universality, can be clearly questioned when we consider the many forms of violence and contradictions of the Western society of technological progress that grew in the 20th century. As we understand it, to embrace otherness, we cannot deny our collections and their history. Instead, we believe we can indeed stimulate new approaches to them by looking at them through the eyes of contemporary issues. At the same time, it is our ethical role to discuss the many contradictions in the making of an institution like MAC USP, firstly and foremost as a reflection of a modernizing project that grew out of the violence of our colonial past and was parallel to the promotion of the myth of racial democracy in Brazil. The latter was a farce that, of course, never existed in the country. And it's high time this changed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anna. So I'm now presenting Marit Ifona Kupka. She is an art scholar, freelance writer, and since 2013, curator of fashion, body, and performance at the Museum für angewandte Kunst in Frankfurt am Main. In her exhibitions, lectures, texts, and interdisciplinary projects, she addresses issues of racism, memory culture, representation, and the decolonization of artistic and cultural practices in Europe and on the African continent. She's part of the interdisciplinary event and exhibition series Talking Objects Lab, which takes place in Berlin, Frankfurt, Nairobi, Dakar, Lagos, and on the internet, and which, based on the current debates on restitutions, explores ways of solidarity and strategies of mediation. Marit, we are looking forward to your lecture entitled Decolonial Premises of Collecting.
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very pleased to be able to speak here today on this solemn occasion and on this highly topical subject, which at the same time is also not surprising, the subject, because it is not only trendy, but it also speaks of a certain concern on part of institutions to be sidelined if they do not take a stand in some way, if not fully engage with what is being negotiated in these debates. Diversity, and here today specifically in museums of modern and contemporary art. Diversity describes a whole complex of topics that relates to areas such as personal structure, management, target groups, and mediation, but also clearly concerns the question of what is shown at all, what is collected, why, and for whom. I talked a lot about these topics in the last 2 years, and usually at this point, I do talk about the history and initial function of museums as nation-building cultural institutions. I'm leaving this out today in view of the time, and also because my lecture will be some kind of continuation of what Barbara Franzen said yesterday about the museum in general. Museums are showcases of themselves and their surroundings. Their condition is an indicator for the condition of their societies. I will focus more on what museums can and must be in order to continue to perform their function in the best sense. And by that, I mean museums as cultural contact zones, as places of mutual transformation. I can assure you at this point that I won't be giving a clear answer on what exactly a museum in the 21st century needs to be. Though I will be giving some answer, surely we all need to open up and relax and maybe look beyond the usual well-trodden paths. In 2019, the freelance curator and project developer Isabel Rabe contacted me to get me involved in the Talking Objects Lab. Isabel Rabe had previously managed an important large-scale project with the Roma archive and is active around the Humboldt Forum in Berlin with its peculiar idea of museum and museality. In the process, she increasingly asked herself what a museum could and should be like and who is needed in the process of developing this museum of the 21st century, probably. And since I'm always interested in trying to find answers to unanswerable questions, we came together for a project that, starting from restitution demands, ultimately goes beyond them and questions the framework conditions of these demands and negotiations and creates or wants to create room for conviviality. But before I get to the project itself, first a bit about our theoretical framework. Walter Mignolo developed his concept of epistemic disobedience in 2006. It is directed against Occidental thinking as a formation of power and knowledge relations. The call for disobedience is a call for resistance against the manifold forms of epistemic violence through which knowledge and research practices are placed in the context of relations of power and dominance. This resistance is not to be thought of as a counter, but rather as a practice that goes beyond binary thinking and implies a so-called delinking, not only from Western thought structures, but from the categories and binary oppositions that have been imposed on other cultures as characteristic structures of the epistemology of Western modernity. Central to this is Mignolo's idea of border thinking, which states that thinking and knowledge do not stop at national and cultural borders, but should, or rather must, establish connections between different cultures and nations. Mignolo refers to the madeness of borders created from the perspective of European colonial expansion. For him, the border is an epistemic metaphor, geographical, political, and subjective, that must be crossed through dialogue on an equal footing and yet at eye level. Resistance takes the form of a conscious crossing of borders between epistemes and an exchange of knowledge in both directions. In short, we all need to unlearn what we know or think we are knowing to create space for knowledge we can't even imagine yet. The Talking Objects Lab Isabel Rabe and I are curating is a think tank exhibition and event series that investigates forms and practices of knowledge and tests strategies of mediation and visualization, together with independent project partners from Kenya and Senegal, specifically the Nest Collective from Nairobi and Malik Ndiaye of the IFAN in Dakar, Senegal. Nigeria and Cameroon will be added next. More European project partners are to come. The selection is not based on logic, but on existing contacts and networks that Isabel Rabe and I have been able to build over the past years through other projects. The Talking Objects Lab explicitly sees itself as a continuation and process. The aim is not to organize events or projects with a clear starting point and ending, but to carry results forward, reflect on mistakes, and develop organically. The Nest Collective has already started the Invisible Inventories program with the Goethe Institute and the National Museum in Nairobi, the Rautenstrauch-Jost Museum in Cologne, and the Weltkulturmuseum in Frankfurt. It is about the provenance of Kenyan artifacts in German museums. The exhibition is currently on view in Frankfurt at the Weltkulturmuseum, and before that it was in Cologne and Nairobi. We hooked into the program at an early stage as observers accompanied it and looked to see where we could pick up threads and continue to spin them in directions that were important but had no space within the set program. This collaborative work is important to us, as is the creation of synergies and fruitful networks. But what we encounter again and again in this context is the inflexibility of funding institutions. If the overall aim is to change the institutions towards more processual approaches and thinking, then also the funding systems need to change. Thinking that projects have a clear starting point and a clear ending is clearly hindering. We are in the middle of a process whose end cannot be reached by ticking off a 10-point list, but possibly by accepting the processual as such, embracing ambivalence. It is also about enduring difference. For as much as we would like to see ourselves as citizens of the world, we are privileged in different ways, and our respective privilege portfolios can be used differently in changing contexts. It is always a question of relation and responsibility as those anchored in Western knowledge systems and institutions to think about one's own privileged position, which is always also part of a modern colonial system. As soon as this thinking and position is recognized as locatable, it also loses its universal claim and must always reacquire validity and legitimacy in specific context. And it is precisely this that needs to be considered as a creative source, because it is in this process of legitimization that contact, encounter, and relationships become possible, and that is much more difficult than it seems. At the Talking Objects Lab, we focus on 5 thematic areas: decolonization of memory, decolonization of knowledge, the re-evaluation of objects from colonial contexts, empowerment and opportunities through artistic perspectives, and questions to classical museum forms of preservation and presentation, which clearly goes beyond ethnological museums. Which culture is seen as the exemplary one? Which cultures are excluded? And it is absolutely essential to understand decolonization as a European challenge and to rethink museums fundamentally. It is often said that the African continent does not have the infrastructure to adequately preserve restituted objects. I want to ask, what does infrastructure and appropriate storage actually mean? I'm aware that reactions such as these are often postponement tactics. They nevertheless pose important questions that also have or should have repercussions for European museum practices. Apart from the fact that rightful owners are, of course, absolutely entitled to decide for themselves what to do with their objects, the question must also be asked whether hoarding things, and here I don't just mean colonial looted art, in museum depots under better or worse conditions, is a sustainable collection model at all, also against the backdrop of changing societies and dramatically changing climatic conditions. And here I would like to quote Max Hollein from yesterday: growing collections means growing buildings, and this costs money. But not only money, also head space. The archive, the collection, these are topics that haunt us already, but will be haunting us even more and more in the coming years. What to do with all those things, and with those things we should care about but haven't even started recognizing. So probably learning from cultures that never had that kind of materialistic culture is a hint. Martina Grieser-Stemschek, Nora Sternfeld, and Luisa Chaya have discussed this in detail from multiple perspectives in their anthology Sich mit Sammlungen anlegen. I want to know, can the debate on restitution and the question of museums on the African continent not also benefit European museums, including those that do not ostensibly deal with looted art? And How can the rich history of relations be reactivated? Because all the questions that seem so highly topical today have already been there. There have been approaches to solutions. There's a culture of mistakes. And how do we recreate this knowledge? Initiatives such as Museums Futures of the Goethe Institute or the Museums Lab on the initiative of the German Foreign Office, which discuss new museum concepts in cooperation between German museums and museums on the African continent, are increasingly developing into exchange platforms instead of paternalistic one-way streets through which institutes of the global south are to be reshaped according to traditional European models. Most national museums on the African continent are sad institutions, a fact. They are strangely empty, and there are several reasons for this, not only the main reason that over 80% of the material culture heritage is not present on the African continent. Cultural life takes place elsewhere, in independent institutions, at festivals and events, fairs, biennales, the absence of things called for other creative solutions. One example, in 1977, Nigeria hosted the Second World Black and African Festival of Arts and Culture, the FESTAC 77, an international Pan-African festival held on the continent once a decade to celebrate African heritage in the post-colonial period. The festival organizers chose the Queen Idia mask to be the emblem of the festival and made an official request to the British Museum for the return of the mask. The British Museum refused, based on concerns about the safety and the security of the mask, which sparked, of course, outrage in Nigeria and across the diaspora. The British Museum then made a replica of the original mask to appease the Nigerians, but it was rejected by the festival organizers and never sent to Nigeria. Instead, they did their own mask. They created their own replica of the Queen Mother mask, which went on view at the festival and was lauded as just as artistically impressive, if not more so than the original. As a testament to the generational nature of craft work in Benin, the artist who sculptured the replica was a descendant of the artist who created the original mask. This made me think about what a future could look like in which we all would lose interest in European models of collecting and archiving, in which the objects would no longer be claimed because their meaning, spiritual energy, heritage, or whatever is attached to them could be made accessible differently, through oral history, for example, bodily practices, etc. What if all the objects were to free themselves from their attachments? They would lose all their symbolic capital, become worthless, empty signifiers. Is cultural heritage really bound up in objects? And I'm aware that I'm expressing very bold thoughts here. I also don't know if this is true. I'm speculating, and in the end, it probably is, as so often, true as it is not. I am interested in the question of whether the essential in cultural spaces does not actually take place in the in-between, between things and between people and people. In the end, the object, the thing, is only a vehicle. The space becomes a contact zone, and what influence does that have on the practice of collecting? This June, our launch event for Talking Objects took place simultaneously in Berlin and Nairobi. Unexpected lessons, decolonizing memory and knowledge. It was a performative discussion festival, keynotes, panels, and artistic inventions alternated. There was a film program and space for discussion and encounter for the unfortunately very limited number of spectators on the site due to COVID regulations. The conference can still be viewed online. The next event will take place on 4th of December in Dakar and can also be followed online. It was not only the COVID travel restrictions that led us to hold the event in hybrid form. The experience gained through numerous COVID-conditioned online events also made us think about travel and meeting in general. For all the advantages of a face-to-face encounter, the virtual encounter also offered something that might not have been so obvious before. In addition to better accessibility, encounters that were previously prevented by visa restrictions became possible. Many of us here today have been to events where people without passport privilege were unable to attend because they were denied a Schengen visa. In addition, traveling does something to you. The experience of exchanging ideas with relaxed, rested people on screen from their respective familiar surroundings is definitely one of the beautiful experiences of meeting people online. At Unexpected Lessons, we also tuned into Nairobi. There, debates happened that we could participate in instead of always inviting others to join our debates. Here, decentralization takes place, which creates a fundament for true encounter. And well, all these encounters, again, are nothing new. I just hint to the rich history of Pan-African movements, where there has been transcontinental cultural exchange at the beginning of the 20th century. How can this be reactivated and transformed in truly global exchange? The delinking that Mignolo talks about is an unlearning of certain structural thinking. There's this famous sentence by Audre Lorde that I always like to quote: "The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house." The logical consequence of this would be to use different tools, to simply make things differently. But what different tools are there to use if we have to assume the master does not only live in the institutions and on the street, but also in us and our relationships, as art mediator and curator Nora Sternfeld assumes? Meaning that being and acting outside of traditional power structures and categories is inconceivable, because even our thinking is permeated by them, and every supposedly new creation only reproduces these categories. So how can we rethink structures if we ourselves are structure? A first step may be to accept chaos, a second to reflect on ourselves and our relationships to each other, and on the recognition of the simultaneity of process and moment. For thinking must change in the process of thinking, or action changes in the process of action. There is no clear starting point, there is no clear path to follow, except perhaps that of learning from each other, which can happen in a collective process, has a radical possibility of collective unlearning. Unlearning of boundaries, borders, dominant narratives, and centers in order to create a free society based on relationships. This is the event in Dakar I was briefly talking about earlier, which will happen on the 4th of December. What knowledge is hidden in objects? What memories are archived in them? What do they have to tell us, and how do we make them speak? The event Les Langues des Objects at the Musée Théodore Monod in Dakar brings together artists and experts from different disciplines to discuss the identities of objects and their inherent knowledge. This also reminds me of what Max Hollein said about objects at the Metropolitan Museum yesterday. What do a helmet mask from the Sandé Society in Sierra Leone and an armor by Henry VIII have in common? I don't know, but I would be curious to know what both objects might have to tell each other. How can we make them speak? Metaphorically spoken, probably, but I hope you get where I'm going. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Marit. Many points of interesting and inspiring approaches for our discussion. We will proceed with the last lecture, and I'm happy to introduce Christian Kavachner, who is with us today. He's an art historian and curator. He's a professor of post-colonial studies at the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna. And he has published widely. His recent books include Das Amerikanische Museum, Sklaverei, Schwarze Geschichte und der Kampf um Gerechtigkeit in Museen der Südstaaten, together with Cornelia Kogoy, which appeared in 2019. And in 2017, he published Transmoderne, eine Kunstgeschichte des Kontakts, which is now forthcoming in English, Transmodern, an art history of contact, 1920 to 60. His lecture is entitled Discontinuities of Collecting.
Thank you, Luisa. I would like to thank, first of all, Sabeth Buchmann for inviting me to speak at this conference, and also thanks to Bettina Brunner for organizing this event in such a pleasing way. I was asked to reflect on my own contribution to the collection policies of the Mumok in the early 2000s. Please let me begin with a scene from Barry Jenkins' wonderful mumblecore film, Medicine for Melancholy. After a one-night stand on a party, a young black woman and a young black man stroll through the city of San Francisco, wondering what to do with their afternoon. Joanne is a designer of t-shirts and the girlfriend of a white curator, being on a trip abroad. Micah works for an aquarium store. When Joanne suggests to visit the MoMA, Micah asks her a question. What do two black folks not do on a Sunday afternoon? What? Go to a museum. In a sort of compromise, instead of going to the art museum, they end up at the Museum of the African Diaspora, where they learn about the transatlantic slave trade, listen to African music, and to the voices of black writers from Olaudah Equiano to Maya Angelou. The scene is a beautiful reflection on a problem that is also known from various studies. Minorities are not among the regular visitors of museums that just tell the story of the dominant groups. In a 2006 study on museum habits of African Americans in Florida, a woman answers the question why she doesn't go to the museum. I quote, "The museums here in America don't give an inclusive history, especially about Black history, and that's why I don't go. I would also like to learn about my history and my culture." So this is obviously not only an American problem, and it doesn't affect Black people alone. For whom are the museums? This is not a new question, even though it may still seem so to some, even museums professionals. 50 years ago, Hans Hake addressed the demographic background of gallery visitors in his quite well-known visitor profile exhibitions. 75 years ago, in the context of the decolonization movement, the question was prominently raised by Madeleine Rousseau and her editorial team of Le Musée Vivant in France. As these examples show, the struggles for social inclusion and the efforts in anti-racist museum policies do actually have a very long tradition. Austrian museums had little part in the story. Among other things, this is due to the systematic denial of the colonial aspects of this country's history. Most museums did not see any reason to open up to post-colonial perspectives on art, culture, and history. However, during the 1990s, questions of migration and cultural identity and difference were prominently discussed in politics and the media, not least because of the success of the radical right-wing FPÖ. Anti-racist movements of these years, like Get to Attack, which I was part of, introduced notions like institutional racism into the discourse, making use of, among others, Etienne Balibar's writings on democracy, border politics, and racism in post-89 Europe. It seemed important to shift the focus from the racist attitudes of some individuals and extremist groupings to the politics of exclusion of the state and its institutions. Some of us who had been interested since long in institutional critique in the field of art felt the need to think together racialized power structures in institutions of art with European border politics, border regimes, and national politics of belonging. Between 2004 and 2005, between 4 and 6, I had the opportunity to give an impulse to the transformation of Mumok's collection, informed by post-colonial discourse. Edelbert Koep, before he became director of the Mumok in 2001, he directed Kunsthaus Bregenz and was professor at the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna. As I had my son in the kindergarten next to Koep's office, we occasionally conversed on issues of art and art institutions. When Koep told me about a volume of artists' statements on museum architecture that he was editing with Kunsthaus Bregenz, I was interested in his project, however argued that it would be necessary to have another book focusing on museums as institutions instead of buildings. Thus, he asked me to edit such a book, which I accepted with great pleasure. The Museum as Arena, Artists on Institutional Critique, published in 2001, included writings on race, migration, and the exhibition complex by artists such as Fred Wilson, Rashid Areen, Adrian Piper, and Jimmy Durham. This is just to give you some background on how it came that eventually I was asked to contribute to reconsidering Mumok's collection in the framework of what would be called the year of collecting. Like most art museums in Europe, the Mumok had so far limited its collection to European and North American art. The exclusion of the art production of by far the greater part of the world from the image of modern and contemporary art appeared questionable against the background of the manifold interconnections of Western and non-Western societies, which are not only a product of the last wave of globalization, but existed since the era of colonialism. In 2004, under the title Beyond NATO Art, I proposed a concept to broaden the limited North Atlantic horizon of the collection. Here is not the place to go into details. 2 points seem relevant to me in retrospect. First, it was made clear from the beginning that the consideration of contemporary art from Africa, Asia, and the Middle East should not be understood as a solution to the problems of the Eurocentric museum, but as a challenge regarding its habits and criteria of collecting significant art of the present. Second, it is important to acknowledge the willingness of the museum's director to take on such a challenge at a time when this was far from guaranteeing the attention that we take for granted today. I still very much appreciate Edelbert Koep's willingness to take this important first step. To cut a long story short, my proposal was accepted and the museum acquired on my suggestion about 80 works by 16 artists within 1.5 years. Most works were on display for the first time in the exhibition Why Pictures Now in 2006. I will show you a few examples here. Works by Vivan Sundaram, Indian artist, Palestinian artist Emily Chassir, Algerian French artist Zineb Zadira, and Australian indigenous artist Destiny Deacon, Moroccan artist Ito Parada, artists whose work were acquired but not shown in this small image selection include Canan Al-Ani, Shadi Gadirian, Zveretun Tetwa, David Goldblatt, Sulika Bouabdellah, Gülsün Kara Mustafa, Gazelle, and Rashid Mashraoui. Instead of additively placing works from African, Asian, or Middle Eastern art worlds alongside the Euro-American ones, we worked in close cooperation with the curators of the Mumok on a perspective on art of different regions that takes notice of mutual references and different interpretations of shared realities. The notion of the relational as a leitmotif of this collection practice rejected any idea of cultural geographical separation. In the exhibition Why Pictures Now, questions about difference in content or method of art from different regions could be discerned by beholding them together. Among other things, the effect of such confrontations on the reception of seemingly familiar artworks are remarkable. For example, when it comes to treatments of gender and identity issues or memories of the past. To rely on relation instead of addition and separation may be taken as self-evident today. However, the older ones among us will well remember the trend in the neo-exoticist art world of the time when it seemed normal to tie cultural packages that marketed art from Africa, India, or the Islamic world as the other to the Euro-American standard. My own approach of the late 90s and the time of my engagement with the Mumok collection was mainly informed by British post-colonial discourse on art, art history, and art institutions in the wake of Rashid Areen's groundbreaking exhibition, The Other Story, and what was called New Internationalism in an influential book edited by Jean Fisher for Eneva in London. It is noteworthy, just as a footnote, that at the time no one would have used the term diversity, which is so prevalent today. You would rather speak of difference when it came to issues of race and ethnicity, and of différance too, in the sense of Derrida, to articulate the conflictual tensions between different experiences and unequal opportunities of social participation and representation in art institutions. Anyway, questions like this and many others concerning the relations between various worlds of art needed to be discussed in a symposium like International Art, Global Aesthetics or Culture of Difference, and a few years later, co-organized with Sabeth Buchmann, we resumed the discussion with a focus on global modernism. In the first part of my paper, I sketched the local political background of these efforts in the revision of Mumok's collection strategies. If the works by non-European artists introduced important issues of race and diaspora, colonialism and Orientalism, border politics and migration, it was also necessary to include local artists who addressed similar questions in their work. All the more if they were at the same time active in anti-racist movements, as was the case with Liesl Pronger. The curators of the current collection, exhibition Enjoy, did include many of these works from the Beyond NATO Art project 2 decades ago. They have implemented something that I had originally hoped for, namely that questions of migration are now articulated from both a Moroccan and an Austrian perspective, like in the case of Ito Parada next to Dorit Margreiter. Side by side, that issues of home and belonging, of body and gender, are addressed by artists from the US, from Austria and Algeria next to each other on the same wall. Such constellations open up new space for critical reflection, and they have the potential to do this for visitors with quite different biographies. Most recently, a few more works related to colonialism and liberation movements were purchased. The Ludwig Foundation supported the acquisition of Ito Parada's film Tree Identification for Beginners. I am especially pleased that we were able to bring into the collection an important work by Belinda Kasim-Kaminski, which addresses Austrian colonial history and the museum from the perspective of the Black Austrian experience. To create a new relationship between museum and society, the museum should build in particular on such positions which illuminate our history, our institutions and archives through the lens of artists with migrant, people of color, Roma and refugee experience. Casting a retrospective look at my choice of artists and artworks 20 years ago makes clear how time-dependent it was. It becomes obvious, for instance, that many of the selected artists critically responded to the politics of Fortress Europe in these years, or to the concurrent neo-Orientalist debates about whaling and the hijab. In a way, everything we do is a product of the conditions of its time, while works of art attain different meanings over the years. Therefore, a consistent continuation of the strategy to diversify Mumok's collection would have been necessary. Unfortunately, this was not the case. Soon after the first steps were taken, the project discontinued, which is indeed disappointing. Since Barry Jenkins' film of 2008, much has changed in the discourse and practice of many museums, especially in the US and the UK. Let's take the Tate Gallery as an example. Today, Tate Britain and Tate Modern tell a completely different story of art since World War II, absolutely different, than they did 20 years ago. Visiting these museums now is much more exciting than it used to be. And we have data showing that what the young man articulated in Medicine for Melancholy is no longer true to the same extent. People of color and other minorities are visiting art museums more frequently when their experiences and their outlook on the world have been part of what the museum wants to show and to speak about. To come to an end, what needs to be done? It is necessary, it is necessary for the museum to develop a consistent strategy for collecting art, which offers different groups of a diverse society possibilities of identification and recognition. As a surplus value for art professionals, which the museum equally has to serve, the museum will become a place that gets much closer to the realities of modern and contemporary art. Who can and who will tackle this task? This brings us to another point which I don't have the time to elaborate on. Beside the necessity of deprovincializing the collection, it is equally important to work seriously to match, at least approximately, the diversity of society and art at the level of the museum's curatorial staff. Without question, this is the more difficult part of the task, as I'm well aware, since universities face similar challenges. However, many museums took up the challenge and made significant progress. This can be a motivation to learn from and to translate other museums' policies into national or regional preconditions. Sunday afternoons in the museum may then look different. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all our speakers. I think we have a lot on the table already. And actually, I wanted to start with a book that was already mentioned, and I didn't know it would be mentioned. sich mit Sammlungen anlegen. So last year I published it together with my colleagues Martina Griese and Nora Sternfeld. And it's entitled Sich mit Sammlungen anlegen, gemeinsame Dinge und alternative Archive. This would be something like contesting collections, common things, and alternative archives. And the German title plays, of course, with a double meaning of anlegen, which is both creating and contesting. So it is about working with collections, testing them, as well as contesting their embedded logics. Double-bound collection work, as Doreen Mende, one of the contributors of the book, has put it. And I will come back to her contribution in a bit later. So we have heard of many different strategies with regards to working with collections, complicating the narrative yesterday with a keynote by Max Hollein, bringing in many different voices, shared authorship, multi-perspectivity, but also approaches of maybe neglecting material heritage and thinking of the museum as more as something that is process-based, as a contact zone. So I was thinking for our panel discussion today, of the discussion that picks up your inputs, to focus on the one hand on concrete curatorial strategies. So we heard before, of course, of many different strategies that contest institutions from the outside, especially by artists, but I would be interested in discussing and also maybe distilling from your individual inputs concrete curatorial strategies that could be experimented with. And on the other hand, I would also like to address what Christian ended with, actually, the question of infrastructure in museums and institutions. So the question of what kind of actual transformations are necessary or have to take place to not just have critique in the museum or critiquing museums and their aforementioned logics, but also giving them sustainable afterlife, so to say, or sustainable different kind of practice. So I don't know, maybe Anna, maybe you would like to start. So the question would also be how, from your specific experience with working with the collection, what kind of general curatorial strategies we could distill.
I think that one of the most important points that we have been discussing at the museum is actually the issue of hierarchy, and this idea of the curator as an individual, as a signature, as a kind of a, as a sole authorship or a sole, container of all the knowledge about something. So the idea to work with the collections in collaboration all the time. So, for instance, there is no, I don't think that in any of the program that we have now on show, or that we are starting to work with now, we are working just one curator. So we are working always together. So this is one thing. The other thing is to partner up with other institutions. So this year, the museum partnered up both with the São Paulo Biennial and with the Museum of Modern Art, because our history with the Museum of Modern Art is also was never tackled. It was very complicated. So as a new generation, we decided, okay, let's face this. Let's start working together and let's try to build a partnership together. So we have, for instance, an exhibition. I didn't have the opportunity to talk about it today, but we have an exhibition going on now in 4 parts in between the 2 museums. So the visitor would have to go to the MAM and to the MAC USP. And the other strategy was also to engage with artists and make artists work with curators. As for the project that the exhibition that you just mentioned when you were presenting me, this is the students group actually working with me as a curator. So we researched into a set of the collection, and they were working on the research, on the presentation, and how to display the collections and so on. So this has been a strategy. Another very important point is actually education. I mean, the art education program, the mediation program of the collections, which is still to be fully tackled, so to speak, but that we understand this is something, for instance, that artist Rosana Paulino, as a member of the museum's board and working with us in the webinar that we organized with the support of the Getty Research Institute, the Getty Foundation, sorry, pointed out very clearly that we, for instance, one of the results of this webinar should be, some kind of material for teachers to work in schools with kids, with younger students. So I would say this.
Thank you, Anna. So it's also, as I understood from your input, it's also about rereading the collection, also reading again, and maybe finding out different kind of layers of meanings and histories that are embedded in artworks, and the very important point of building up relations and collaborating. So actually a point that was mentioned by all of you, but maybe we proceed with you, Marit.
Yes, I think the aspect of collaboration is very important and definitely needs to be worked on more in the future, because from my work, I always encounter like borders that, and most of them are like structural borders that, of course, we talked about this earlier, that it is not so easy. You know, it's easy to say, okay, we need to collaborate, and it's such a good idea. There's like this institution, and they have an interesting collection, and maybe we can just work on something together, make an exhibition, and then visitors can just walk from one institution to the other, or even like not in the same city, but also like in transnational or transcontinental even. This sounds very good and very, very interesting to do, but then there are always those structural limits we are facing, which actually really tackle down to very tiny looking structural problems that even within one city, then you have maybe a very interesting curator working in another institution, and then you're like, okay, so maybe we can like lend those expertise and work on something together. And then you're like, okay, but I'm like on the payroll of this museum, and these are like all those tiny structural problems. And as I also said in my presentation, we also face that continuously with funding institution, because we are very we rely much on funding, of course, and then we have to write those very important, very fun part abstract and apply for the funding, and then you always have to explain. And then on the other side, sits a person who reads it and has to make a first decision if your application will be handed over to the jury, or you have like maybe formal aspects, you're not matching the formal aspects. So you always have to squeeze your project into this box and try to, as I also said, the project has to have like a clear starting point and a clear ending. What's your goal? Where do you want to go with this project? And so we kind of like always facing those weird structural limitations, which actually think really need to be considered in this whole process of we need to embrace change, or we need to restructure the museum. So it needs to be like the restructuring process needs to be like broadened up and also applied to all the related parts.
So it also needs this kind of awareness within institutions, but also within different stakeholders of or people being in deciding about, for example, research projects or applications, stuff like that. So we need to rethink also the formal structural, I would say, framework. And as you mentioned, there are so many limits in the practical, everyday working conditions within institutions that that make it very difficult and tiring. And for sure, these kind of process-oriented approaches are a question of, being resilient in a way against all those kind of, on the one hand, pressures, expectations also of a starting and an end point and a result and a product, and so on. So, but I was also interested in your perspective on this danger of reproducing logics of colonial thinking, of these kind of power knowledge apparatuses that were addressed today, and how we could avoid to reproduce them, regarding, filling up the voids that we have in institutional collections.
Yeah, I would love to give an answer to that. So how do we overcome this? I don't know, but as I also said, I think it's important to do things and to engage in the process, and also with having in mind that having a specific idea of a goal in mind, and then just go there, and also be open for mistakes, because there will be mistakes, and then you will end up at some point and realizing, shit, I just reproduced, I did it again.
As we said before, it's also about unlearning what is so much somehow inscribed into our thinking or approach to art and material cultures.
And it's maybe maybe it needs to be more thought, as a process, of course, but also maybe as a dance also, in a way. You always go one step further and then one back. You really need to think it's important to engage, really embrace the process.
Mm-hmm. Christian, what would you bring into this discussion? As you mentioned before, it's a lot about relation and relating contexts, topics, and also trying to avoid this kind of stereotyped geographic attribution, of course, but also seen from this distance of about almost 20 years. How would you approach curatorial and also collecting practices that avoid or that see the possibilities and limits of decolonial and anti-racist curating and collecting?
Yeah, so, okay, it's a lot of questions, and obviously I will answer not all of them, and maybe even not one. Let's start with, I was really interested in your case of the famous and at the same time problematic painting by Tarsila do Amaral, and how you start to and actually go into the practice of critically dealing with this heritage by also the use of contemporary artists, but not only contemporary artists, and that's found particularly interesting. Also historic artists like Jacob Lawrence. Mm-hmm. And so that would be one of my questions, but I have to give answers right now. Yeah. My questions would be about the actual work of relating these artworks in a specific situation. And that is also related to what the curators of the Enjoy exhibition did in a great way. I think they did really a great job in a new approach of presenting the historic collection, the collection of the early 20th century avant-gardes, in the light or through the lens of contemporary artists' critical viewpoints. So for instance, Heike Eipeldauer did at her chapter on early modern European avant-gardes from Brancusi to Picasso and Max Ernst and so on, with bringing in critical perspectives on race, on stereotypes, on colonial issues by artists like Destiny Deacon, by Kara Walker, by also white artists like Andrea Fraser and her photo series on white people in West Africa. And this works, in my understanding, quite well there's no definite answer to how you deal with this heritage, but and also the works of Judith Hopf. So, articulating this notion of the mask so prominent in so-called primitivist modernism, and this opens a lot of new, to me, I had absolutely no influence on all this. But when I saw this exhibition for the first time, I was really happy with many of these constellations, because, I have been for decades a great fan of the work of Maria Hahnenkamp, of the work of Dorit Margreiter, as Austrian artists who I know personally very well and her work and so on. And now in the light of Zeynep Sedira's work, for instance, Hahnenkamp looks again different and even more interesting than before. Dorit Margreiter looks different. Her work about the Chinese diaspora in the United States looks different now, and also, to me at least, even more, even if I have loved this work for all my life, more interested in comparison with Ito Parada's position on not border thinking, but border crossing, more border crossing than border thinking. And yes, I have a lot of questions also to my fellow panelists. So this is one I already addressed, related to how do you actually work with Jacob Lawrence in relation to Amara?
I think we haven't solved the problem yet, so to speak. Because there is an issue of how to not only the presentation of the collections in terms of an exhibition, but we understood from the beginning that the exhibition is just one layer of how people engage with the museum. So we have that. We have the mediation program. We have the social network that now is pretty active for all museums all over the world, but we are paying special attention to this. So I don't think we really solved if this is going to be put next to each other and you have a text explaining or something like that. But we are still discussing on how, because the other danger was, while we were selecting the works, is just to also put this into a niche that they are all related to that, and then you segregate again. You know what I mean? So how to really make things converse. So the architect now, who's also a curator for the exhibition, and he's the deputy director in the museum, very bright colleague, is thinking about open spaces actually, where you can have cross readings of the works. So this would be a solution. But I wanted to add one thing else to what maybe Margret, you talking about, which is how to really put down the barriers into different, like this. How do you set because museums can be very, institutions in general, they are very, very crystallized structures. And to move them, you have to really go from down up. And my experience recently as the museum director, I have always been a professor there, but there is a very, very strict hierarchy between professors, staff members, and students at the University of São Paulo. And how do you, being a woman, it was already a challenge. So how do we break that? How do we go through from one place to the other? And it's very, it demands the patience of a teacher. You have to re-educate people somehow. And One strategy that we thought really worked in the museum, especially during the pandemic, because we needed to put into places different strategies to reopen the museum, to start going back and taking care of the collections and so on, was to create these working groups that went from one department to the other, so that you had representatives from different departments thinking together to solve a specific problem in the museum. And it really worked well, and they felt more belonging into, because that's the other thing. We are always talking about the museums in regard to the objects, not the people that are also in the background and give all the infrastructure for these objects to exist and to be there for the fruition of the public. No?
I like how you break up the structure by actually breaking up the architecture of the building. So this...
Yeah. Well, this was another thing too, and it was great to have Marta again with us as a vice director of the museum, because this is another thing too. The museum was renovated. I mean, the building was renovated to house the museum. The thinking behind it was to think about a white cube, which of course an architectural building by Oscar Niemeyer never is. So the Clarera was a place where you can actually create this kind of porosity between inside, outside, and really change that appearance or the image of this the museum as a white cube, because the building is not a white cube. But it took some time for people to understand that. In any case.
So actually, I would think that something like, or the idea or notion of relinking and delinking would be something that connects all these kind of strategies, on the one hand on the curatorial, but also on the institutional level. And actually, I was just thinking of an exhibition that is entitled Delinking, Relinking. I don't know if you heard of it. It's the current new collection display at Van Abbe Museum in Eindhoven. And it just opened, I think, in December. And I think they did a tremendous job with this kind of new presentation of the collection that tries to overcome these kind of known modernist kind of readings of their, of course, important collection, and the question of how to relink kind of different kind of modernities on the one hand, and of course working through the lens of contemporary questions, approaches of contemporary artists as well, and working also on the level both of the space and of the atmosphere, I would say, because it was also trying to actively bring in questions of barriers that we usually don't think about or even experience as usual museum visitors. So it's also about putting down barriers for people who are disabled, for people who are not able to read or to see or to smell. So they are working on many different levels. And I think it's very inspiring case of how an institution really tries to, building up also on the work of the last, I would say, 20 years that have been done there, in a very impressive kind of showcase. But in the second round, I wanted also to get to this question of infrastructure. And for this, I'm coming back to Doreen Mendes' contribution to the book that was mentioned before. And she concludes her aforementioned essay with the following, and I quote, "In practical terms, this would mean stable employment contracts for colleagues, curators, artists, experts with diasporic knowledge in collection work, leading positions for Afro-Europeans, space for collective as well as interdisciplinary processes in the institution, a policy of epistemic diversity, paid research residencies for artists from the three continental geographies in European collecting institutions, post-ethnographic and process-oriented work, increasing government funding programs for para academic collaborations, etc. So she addresses many points that are of huge importance, I think, in this kind of necessary transformations of the structures of institutions. And from your individual perspectives, I would also like to bring together, what kind of infrastructural transformations and changes are needed in European and Western museums of modern and contemporary art.
Okay. I would underline many of these things that Doreen Mendes said. I'm working with her in a project on also on African European art histories, in particular from the post-war to the 1970s, 80s. But there's also something that I think is necessary to add, because it's a larger problem. And the problem is that if you see what museums do, how museums adapt certain kinds of anti-racist discourses into their own kind of politics, many European museums do exactly the same what the commercial industries do. So until a few years ago, in the TV commercials, you would have seen only white people. Now I'm really a very frequent TV consumer, so I know what I speak about. Within a few years, we have a tremendous increase of black people and people of color in the TV commercials. What we never see, is the migrant, the refugee from Afghanistan, the veiled woman, the Turkish woman. Absolutely no. So it's a kind of copy of American style. There is nothing bad about including this. Is very important, of course, but it's a kind of misreading and misinterpretation of everything that we actually should fight for and argue for. It's just a trend and a fashion, and it has nothing to. It's to sell your products better and to different markets. And museums behave the same. And so we should really think of so many other so-called minorities that have been here for so many years and decades, working, supporting the system, contributing to everything, to the economy, to the our financial department, and have never been represented. So I think that there's a problem with this. And another problem with import-export of knowledge power is the Walter Mignolo publishing industrial complex, that I call it. I'm very skeptical of that. And this kind of global distribution of one particular position that reduces, in my point, this is very polemic now, it reduces many so extremely complex issues and phenomena to a set of 12 phrases that are easily to be repeated by everyone who never did care of anything in the real, in society, in workers' situations, in so many other things. So I'm really a bit, this would be something that I would ask you to re-export Mignolo to the African continent, where Africans have developed so many important decolonizing thoughts, and in particular in Kenya. So this kind of, I'm skeptical about that. And we should also, it's not just, this is a kind of dominant, industry that they publish at least 50 books and more or less the same content all the time. But people try to, epistemic disobedience, this sounds good. We say the same for an institutionally commissioned project at the Academy of Fine Arts, for instance. So it's a bit more complex in my point of view.
Yeah, you're right. So it's not about catchwords or catchphrases. And what you brought in before is also a question of class, I think, which is not very present. So it's not just about identities, but also the neglected question of class, which is very, very dominant, I think. But please.
Two things I would like to, because we are not importing Walter Mignolo to the African continent, which is not really working as we experienced in the contact, in the relation, in the discussions, because there are definitely there is another discourse going on. So this is also like an interesting part of our process, that we come with our thinking and then get into contact and then realize, okay, maybe there's a limit here again, and that we need to rethink and restructure, which is happening. So that's also very, and to be open for this, of course, to have like, okay, because this is like, that's a background where I'm coming from, and now I'm here and like, okay, it's not working. So, or not really working. So we need to readapt. So it was very important for us, of course, to also tune into discourses and debates that are happening in Nairobi. And that we came like with our thoughts and books and then realized they don't even know them because they're not important, or they have like other debates, discussions going on. So and then to see like, okay, so maybe, we need to reach something else then. And maybe also about, I think you also said that it seems to be an import of American discourses, or like US American discourses also, or pictures or strategies. And I don't watch that much TV, but I read like magazines. So of course it's kind of the same, where you see like in commercials that like I grew up in Germany, and when I was younger there was no black person in the magazine, and now they are kind of like everywhere. So that it kind of feels strange to me as well, you know, like on the first hand I see like, okay, there are like people that kind of like look like me, or have probably like I can imagine that they have like a similar background, but at the same time I'm also like afraid that this is like, okay, this is a trend, and so where's the backlash, and people will, and at the same time it's not a precise reflection of what society is. And especially speaking of like, yes, I was born, grew up in Germany, so Germany is kind of my main reference pool. My background. And it's a different background than an African-American background, and different than an African-American discourse as well. And so probably my experience and me growing up in Germany is much closer to the experience of like a descendant of like a so-called Gastarbeiter story than the one of like an African-American background. So, but then I'm always confronted with the discourse that got imported from there, or like a concept that got imported from there. So I really think that it is important to see the difference, and to see, okay, like a person with a specific skin color does not necessarily have like the same experiences and the same background, so that it's very important to always see the content. And this is also something that we need to really work on and see more in the coming years, I think.
Well, I think that in terms of European North American museums, as a Brazilian researcher and curator, what I understand that as I came here talking about one of the masterpieces in our collections, which is of course by a Brazilian artist, and that's okay when I talk about her because I'm a Brazilian, so it's just natural that I talk about a Brazilian. But this is not my field of studies at all. So I'm working with as a scholar, I'm working with a collection of Italian modern painting in Brazil that has lots of very interesting developments in terms of how fascist Italy related to Brazil in the 20s and the 30s and so on, and why this ended up in Brazil, and why it has an impact on our collection, and why Brazilian artists were fascinated with that kind of language and so on. But if I go into the international platform, I'm supposed to talk about Brazilian art. And of course, I could never, would be unthinkable for a Brazilian curator for a long time to look into Jacob Lawrence and put Jacob Lawrence close to Tarsila do Amaral. So this is one of the exercises that we did in 2016. There was something that was practically understood as natural for Brazilian art historiography, to treat Brazilian art historiography as something in a niche again, separated and from other works of art that we do have in our collections, that other museums in the city have in their collections, that didn't really belong to us. I mean, they were there just because. And they are not there just because. They are there because there's a whole historical context that built those collections in Brazil in the aftermath of Second World War. So we are implicated in that story. So if you want to talk about provenance and about restitution and so on, I understand we are deep in there too. But for a long time, this was not an issue for Brazilian art historiography, I would say. This is a recent thing, that you have a younger generation that feels more free to talk about other subjects. But still, I think, and there is the other complication as well, I believe that maybe, Margret, this is your reality dealing with African institutions. Every time we start talking about something that's maybe a Brazilian topic, as we waste some time giving a background because it's not in the current, so to speak, discourse or teaching of art history programs all over the world. This is little by little changing, but still you have to say, okay, so I'm talking about this painter is such and such, and so on. Whereas if you are an Italian from, I don't know, the very conservative academy field in Italy, or very traditional university, and you talk about Michelangelo, even a Japanese, a Chinese, or an African or a Brazilian will know who Michelangelo is. So I think this is the gap also that we have to start overcoming, so to speak.
I think at this point I would like to open up to the audience. Are there any questions, remarks, things you would like to know about the presented projects more in detail?
Yeah, thank you so much for all your contributions and for the very interesting and instructive discussion. I would like to pick up that discourse on infrastructures, since I think that is so relevant to the contemporary discourse on institutions like museums, because of course we are facing the next lockdown, and we have learned in the past 2 years to think about relevant infrastructures or irrelevant infrastructures. And I listened to a very interesting discussion that was between some colleagues from Munich, like Bojo Dramagoju, and some others on infrastructures and transport. And one of your colleagues, Stefanie Weber from the Limbach House, who did a new perspective on the Blaue Reiter, she warned against the risk that museums should understand themselves as relevant infrastructures, because she said that probably goes along with a risk that they lose their autonomy, that they are always asked to be linked to institutions of education, to institutions of society, which she is not against it, but she sees a little bit the danger that museums get in too much of dependency from political claims that museums should serve or should be a kind of social or societal avant-garde, instead of saying no, museums under huge pressure, they have huge problems. All we can do is to be solidaric, but not to be the avant-garde in being the better institution. I just wanted to bring it in because it right now came up in your discussion. Probably you have an opinion on that. I thought quite provoking position.
Well, I can give you the actual situation in Brazil. In terms of museums, we have, in the case of the MAC USP, we are a university museum, so we are under this public institution. That's the University of Brazil, the University of São Paulo, and which is funded by the state of São Paulo, the government of the state of São Paulo, through the Secretary of Science and Technology and so on. I must say that I consider myself, though I have a very, very difficult budget to work with my my program, and I know I have lots of situations of cuts and things like that. I must say that in terms of autonomy, of what I want to do in the museum with the colleagues and who I want to bring and what the program should be, I feel much freer than other colleagues in other museums, because they are always answering back to, of course, we have the board of trustees of the museum as well, but these are people selected from scholars, professors, artists, curators, and things like that. So you have more like an audience that will discuss with us what we would like to, what we present as a program, rather than someone telling us, no, I'd rather you do this because politically speaking. So I don't feel like the University of São Paulo has this kind of grasp into what we think, or politically speaking. No? On the other hand, it's true that it took us a while to change. I'm probably the first museum director who is not a full professor. So there was this hierarchy there as well. On the other hand, the museum is historically the museum that has the most women directors in the country. So it's, in terms of private institutions, the situation in Brazil is very particular. So private institutions depend a lot on private sponsors, of course. And there is this kind of, there is no real public sense of supporting institutions. So what these sponsors will do, or these patrons will do, is to use the incentive law for culture to sponsor the institution. So in the end, it's public money, from my viewpoint. No? And now they are really in struggle because the federal government has cut it off, everything, no, for various reasons that I don't want to explain here. I mean, you've been hearing the news about Brazil. So I understand that it depends on what kind of institutional context you are in. No? To conceive of an institution as a completely autonomous thing, I don't know. Maybe here, but certainly not. This wouldn't be possible in Brazil.
Does anyone of you also want to react to this?
Maybe you, because I'm not a museum practitioner. I don't feel really qualified to answer the question, but I think...
Well, actually, I would have to.
Yeah.
I don't know. So my take on this thing, on this question of autonomy is, I don't know. I think it's also a question of cultural policies and how cultural policies could also bring forward emancipatory institutional policies. So we could also turn around this kind of question of, this kind of question of independency, but also the task of the museum, which it has for society. So I would see this kind of infrastructure question in a differentiated way, I would say. Yeah, but it's a huge topic, of course. Are there any more questions or comments?
If not, I have another one. It is to you, Marit, since you referred very much to the term of unlearning or de-learning, which is, of course, crucial to the whole debate and which was also kind of conceptual for the last documenta. I'm thinking of discussions we have at our institute with Christian and other colleagues. And we are always in this tension to say, okay, we want to propose different canons, right? Is that the plural? And this is, I quote right now, Christian, but first they have to learn what the canon is in order to teach them against what the counter canon should be. So is it exactly about de-learning or is it about different concepts of critique? I'm a little bit struggling with that because this semester I teach again Impressionism. Yeah.
Good decision.
And of course I bring in feminist perspectives and decolonial perspectives. But at the same time, you know, I try to teach them some basics, and that is my denomination. Yeah.
Yeah, I think in the term de-learning or gegen whatever, against, there's always, part of this is always that there needs to be something before that then you can go against, of course. But I wouldn't say that you should stop teaching Impressionism. Because, as you said, I think it is also important to maybe not teach it as, I think it's important to have what Haltung you have when the attitude you're teaching it with, and not saying like, okay, this is Impressionism, this is like this super important epoch in art history. Maybe teaching it as, there was Impressionism, and this is maybe interesting about it, and this is maybe problematic about it, and it is one part in art history in general, but it's not like a part of the art history, and then to maybe to see it just as one story of many different other possible stories, and then of course give the opportunity to probably also teach the other stories as well, and then see what all of this develops into, because I think it is more like, what I'm more interested in is to see what develops out of it organically when you have like Impressionism and probably take on maybe the same time period but from a completely other space. So and when you have like both the knowledge, what develops out of this, if this answers the question.
I think Christine wants to answer.
I really hate to correct Sabeth, but Sabeth's quote was not absolutely correct. So my position would never be you have to learn first the canon and then do everything else. No, that's important to underline. It is what we have discussed was very much based on the experience that in opposition maybe, or in distinction to our background as art historians and what we learned at the universities and the art history departments and so on, we learned the canon, but the experience with students at the academy, for instance, Academy of Fine Arts, is that very few of them have any idea of the canon. So it doesn't really work to deconstruct the canon, because the canon is already, let's say, very much destabilized or undermined or whatever. But this is not only good. I think it's also a bit of a problem. So, for instance, if I come to visit the great Enjoy collection exhibition with a group of students, and we would see Konstantin Brancusi's work there, and we understand and we appreciate the necessary, reframing of this work, which is deeply embedded in colonialist and colonial racist imaginations and so on. But on the other hand, has a very important role in art history to play, or played a very extremely important history, and not only for white avant-gardist artists, but also for black ones. So the students have never heard of Brancusi. Why care about this guy? I mean, maybe he was just a racist, so forget him. This is a problem. Yeah. And same with philosophy. Okay, Kant, he wrote some racist things. Yes, he did, and we should really discuss it very, very critically. But the only knowledge being about Kant, that he was a racist, and forget, is also problematic. So I think this is it's actually really a challenge to do different things more or less at the same time. As the chronopolitics would be a little bit different as you phrased it, but of course you addressed hugely important questions that we face at the academies and universities in similar way than museums do.
If I may quickly answer, I of course hate that you think that I quoted you in a linear causal sense. That was not my ambition. Nevertheless, you put it very correctly, what we were discussing. And I see right now a big pressure because this term of de-learning, and therefore I ask you for that, is used by some of our colleagues in order to claim the self-abolishment or the abolishment. Yeah, we would count as lefty liberals. Yeah, not radical enough really to stop with this kind of art history, and that is, I think, a new challenge, and that is a real conflict in the field. So therefore, I was addressing that. Yeah. Okay.
Actually, yeah. Maybe one last remark, because I think we're a little bit over time. Okay. I'm so sorry. But
no, just going back to your impressionism teaching, Sabeth, my experience is that I think I can talk with some property about it, because I studied the Impressionists in the collection of MASP in São Paulo when I was a doctoral student. The Impressionists are not the same here in Brazil or in the United States or in France. That's the other thing too. I mean, it depends a lot on the works, who chose them. So this, going back to the collections and to the objects, they are necessarily telling different stories. The Picasso here that we saw today with Heiner Fuchs is totally different from the Picassos we have in São Paulo, or the Picassos you have at the MoMA. We are used to the Picassos that we have at the MoMA. That's the major discourse, and that's the thing. But every time you go back to the works, they tell different stories, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Well, I think we have addressed many kind of very important questions in relation to this question of diversity in museums of modern and contemporary art. I thank you all for your inspiring contributions, and I think we will have now a break, and we will continue with the next panel, I think in half an hour. Is that correct? Right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Ich meine, diese Frage.